Hello, everyone. Hello. Professor Chomsky, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Mohammed Shakibnia. I'm a graduate student in the School of Public Policy. And I first wanted to start off by thanking our sponsors today for helping with this event. First is the Muslim Student Association, the Center for Global Health, the Honors College, the President's Commission on the Status of Women, and associated students of Oregon State University who helped with purchasing copies of Professor Chomsky's book, Notes on Resistance with David Barsamian for 60 students to be able to have for free today. So thank you to them for their generosity in being able to make that happen. I also wanted to start off with a land acknowledgement as well. So Oregon State University in Corvallis is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampanipu Band of the Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to the reservations in Western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Select Indians. Indigenous people are valued, contributing members of the Oregon State community, and represent multiple sovereign tribes among students, faculty, and alumni. I'm also very excited to have Professor Chomsky here with us today. Professor Chomsky generously volunteered his time to be able to talk about his book, Notes on Resistance. And this comes about 30 years after Professor Chomsky came to Oregon State University back in about 1995, when he gave a PAC talk to the at the LaSalle Stewart Center, where there was actually an overflow room that was required. And here we're excited to have about 150 people, 200 people within the room today at the MU Horizon Room, Professor Chomsky, who are listening to you, and many, many more also who are listening virtual on the webinar today. So please give a round of applause to Professor Chomsky for being here.
Thank you. Very pleased to be back with you.
Professor Chomsky has also been an intellectual hero of mine since I even entered political consciousness. So I'm very happy to have him and share this experience with you all. That being said, I also wanted to talk about the format for today's event. So me and my co-moderator, Professor Chun-Hui Chi, will be co-moderating, and we'll be asking Professor Chomsky questions for about 30 to 40 minutes based on the remote questions that we received and some questions that we also came up with. And then we'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A for about 20 to 30 minutes to be able to ask their own questions. So I also wanted to introduce Professor Chi, who is my co-moderator, and he is a professor of the Global Health Program and a professor of Health Management and Policy. He founded OSU's International Health Program in 1993, which was renamed the Global Health Program in 2017. His expertise includes health system strengthening and finance, health governance, equity in health and health system finance, priority setting in healthcare, global health governance, and a critical framework of program planning and evaluation. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he developed expertise in comparative pandemic control policies. Since the pandemic, he has been interviewed by international media and US media on the subject of COVID-19 for over 400 times. He completed his MPH in the International Health degree from the University of Texas School of Public Health in Houston, and a Doctor of Science degree in Health Policy and Management from the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. So thank you very much, Dr. Chi, for helping make this event happen today as well. And Dr. Chi will be opening up with questions to ask Professor Chomsky.
Thank you, Mohammed. We also need to give credit. He started this initiative and the idea of interviewing Professor Chomsky. In 1997, OSU invited Professor Chomsky as the resident scholar for 1 week. And at that time, as a young professor, I follow him every day to every single small big talk. And so I'm so appreciate that Professor Chomsky agreed to this interview. And so Mohammed and I, we will take turn to interview. For us, Professor Chomsky questions. So I will start with the first question for Professor Chomsky. So all in all, I have two broad questions, and each broad question I kind of divided to a few related questions. So my first broad question to Professor Chomsky is about the future of democracy. And within this broad question, my first sub-question is, Professor Chomsky, what do you think are the major threats to the future of democracy in the US and around the world? For example, why are we seeing more and more emerging authoritarianism and dictatorship around the world, and how people are embracing them in the last decade?
Well, there certainly is a period in which commitment to democracy is severely declining. We can watch what's happening in various parts of the world. 2 days ago, we saw an election in Turkey. Like it or not, the results are that about half, maybe more than half of the population prefers radical Islamic autocracy to democracy. That's basically Erdogan's strong point, with his strong base in the rural, very religious community. If you look at Iran, we tend to focus on the protests, the courageous protests of mostly originated by young women, but bringing in many others to challenge the harsh, brutal autocracy. But the fact of the matter is that a large percentage of the population against rule, religious, supports them. You look at Israel, its shreds of democracy are severely declining, and a large part of the population, probably a majority, really doesn't want a secular democracy, but rather a religious, nationalist, ethnocratic system. Go to India, great popularity for Narendra Modi, who's committed to dismantling Indian secular democracy and imposing a Hindu ethnocracy. Let's take a look at ourselves. The Republican Party is pretty openly by now indicating that its goal is to dismantle what there is of a functioning democratic system. We see it very clearly, first of all, in policy choices, like the efforts in Republican-led states to curtail voting opportunities, prevent college students from voting because they vote the wrong way, prevent minorities from voting, redistribute districts so that the conservative, rural, traditional minority will have overwhelming voting capacity to ensure Republican dominance. A couple of months ago, at Dallas, Texas, there was a meeting called by the Conservative Political Action Caucus. That's pretty much the core of the Republican Party. Their keynote speaker was Viktor Orban, who's famous in Europe for creating what's called an illiberal democracy, which means a democracy only in form, but a powerful state controls media, suppresses opposition groups, eliminates academic freedom, with the support of substantial part of the population, again, on racist ethnic grounds. In fact, a couple of months before that, Viktor Orban himself had organized a conference, an international conference of the most reactionary right-wing forces in Europe, most of them with neo-fascist origins. The star performer at his conference was the Republican Party, Conservative Political Action Caucus. President Trump made a major speech lauding Orban, the leading television personality. Tucker Carlson had just produced a documentary lauding him for what he was doing, saving Christian right-wing nationalism from external onslaughts. He also gave an ode to Orban. And we can go around the world. These tendencies are real, and we can ask why they're appearing in such strength today. I think there are reasons for it. One fundamental reason is a substantial breakdown in the social order in the past 40 years. There has been, you're familiar with Margaret Thatcher's famous statement, there is no society, just individuals somehow finding their way on the market. Paralleled by Ronald Reagan, government is the problem, not the solution. Both of these statements heralded an onslaught against society throughout the world. It's called neoliberalism. It's described formally as having a commitment to markets in a small state, but that's complete nonsense. It's committed to radical interference in markets, can easily demonstrate this, for the benefit of a small minority and increasing power of government working for the same small minority. And it's had results. We can see it in the United States. In the past 40 years, about $50 trillion has been transferred from working people in the middle class to the top 1% in the course of these programs of policies for radical centralization of power in an unaccountable private sector. One of the first acts of Reagan and Thatcher right away was to attack and undermine labor unions, which are the main means of defense for the population against unaccountable private power supported by a powerful state. That's one or another form of this has been happening throughout the world. Could describe the details. I think that's a large part of the background for the rise of a population that is angry, resentful, contemptuous of institutions with some justice because they're not working for them, and easy terrain for demagogues who'll say, I'll be your savior, I'll stab you in the back with one hand while I hold up a banner in the other hand saying, I love you. That's pretty much what we're seeing. And part of it is what you asked about, fear, a mood that says democracy doesn't work for us. Let's move to some kind of ethnic, religious, nationalist autocracy. We've seen it before. I'm old enough to remember the 1930s quite vividly. That's what was happening.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. You mentioned neoliberalism as one of the major forces that contributed to the erosion of democracy. And I'm wondering, besides neoliberalism, To what extent are you seeing the major causes for the division of our society, both here and around the world? For example, to what extent, besides neoliberalism, do you think the role of religious fundamentalism, racism, and misinformation contribute to this division and erosion of democracy?
Misinformation is rampant and praised, lauded. We saw that pretty dramatically in the CNN fiasco with President Trump. The fact checkers couldn't keep up with the flood of lies, but the audience loved it. The more lies there were, the more they applauded, because who cares? Here's somebody who at least stands up and says, I'm working for you. Well, as I said, he's stabbing him in the back at every point. That's effective demagoguery. Truth doesn't matter. Lies don't matter. We're just going to show our contempt for institutions which have failed us. So there's an open terrain for demagogues and also for incessant lying, which has no effect because who cares? We want to somehow, I think you can understand that if you go to Eastern Oregon, you can see why people want to pull out and join Idaho. Have nothing to do with these people who are talking about liberal values. They don't work for us. You're in a rural town anywhere in the United States, what do you see? You see the former industrial base is gone because of plans designed to deindustrialize the country in the interests of financial capital. Banks are boarded up, stores are boarded up, maybe this church is still remaining, young people are leaving. Why should we want that kind of system? So yes, that's where the Trumps come in, the Orbans, the DeSantises, and so on. They say, the Modis, we have a way out, religious nationalism. Well, in the United States, you have the story of the Great Replacement, very widely believed. I think large majority of Republicans, the Democrats are trying to bring in illegal immigrants who are, as Trump said, rapists, murderers, and so on, to eliminate the white race. Total fantasy, but so was the idea in the 1930s in Germany that Jews are trying to destroy the Aryan race and we have to protect ourselves from them. There are circumstances in which people can fall prey to these beliefs. We've seen it before. We're seeing a good deal of it now. And we have to look back at the social and political conditions under which these pathologies arise and gain extensive popular support. Can ask the same questions about Turkey, Iran, Israel, others, also about ourselves.
Thank you very much. And my last question under the topic of the future of democracy is, with your explanation, it seems we are seeing a green future of the democracy. So my last question for Professor Chomsky is, what do you see as an effective strategy to revitalize democracy and to infuse hope, particularly given the division of our community, our society? How can we revitalize people's sense of community, solidarity, and compassion? And particularly both in this country and globally, we need a vibrant democracy to fight the bigger challenge, the climate change.
We have a history from which we can learn. Let's start from the 1930s. As I say, my own formative experiences, Europe descended into the darkness of the most evil doctrines that have ever captured popular backing and force, the monstrosities of Nazism. Germany was in many ways the most civilized country in the Western world. 1920s was the peak of the arts and the sciences, was regarded as a model of democracy. Many things happened, including the onset of the Depression, the aftermath of the cruel and brutal Versailles Treaty, opened the doors for Hitler and the descent to the deepest depths that humans have ever descended to. That was Europe. Meanwhile, the United States was leading the way to social democracy. There's a deep depression in the United States, much worse than anything we experience now, but it was a hopeful period. I remember very well my own family, first generation immigrants, working class, mostly unemployed, quite hopeful. They had the unions had revitalized. Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare had virtually crushed the union movement and the labor movement in the United States. The 20s were a period rather like today. The unions, militant unionism began to develop. There were independent political organizations. The unions weren't just improve our wages. They were cultural, educational institutions. There was a lively political culture, sympathetic administration, established the New Deal policies that we're all still benefiting from under major attack, but to the extent they still exist, we're benefiting from them. That led the way to what became the social democratic developments in Europe after the Second World War. Well, how did it happen? By engaged, dedicated people who weren't going to give up, but kept struggling and won quite a lot. Pretty much the same thing happened in the 1960s. The activism of the 1960s, and this, at that point, led pretty much by young people, achieved quite remarkable results. The country's a much more civilized place today because of the 60s activism and its aftermath. You can see that if you look back to what the country was like in the 1950s and 60s. We forget what it was like, but we shouldn't. There were miscegenation laws, anti-miscegenation laws in the United States, so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. This was in much of the country. There were there was federal housing, but by law, it was segregated. So that meant that if a Black worker in the growth period of the 1950s was able to get a decent job in an auto plant, couldn't buy a home, federally supported home. The Black population was cut out from the great growth period of the 50s and 60s because of racist federal laws segregating federal housing. Has a main wealth in the United States for most people is the property you own. It's had a tremendous, very bitter legacy. Women's rights. The United States was still under the official legal system of the founding fathers, which held that women are not persons. They are property of the father handed over to the husband. Of course, there had been advances, but still women were not recognized by the law as legally persons, as peers. Didn't change till 1975 as a result of the growing feminist movement spearheaded by young women. There was no opposition to aggression. When John F. Kennedy radically escalated the war against South Vietnam, no protest. You couldn't get 5 people together to talk about it, literally. Into the 60s, it changed very substantially. In many ways, the country became much more civilized, and it was the same thing as in the 30s. Engaged, dedicated people, struggling hard, plenty of barriers, didn't give up. Well, I think that's the answer to your question. You look over history, that's the way it's always been. Gifts don't come down from above like manna from heaven. You have to struggle for them.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky. Now, Mohammed is going to ask Steve for question.
Professor Chomsky, I wanted to touch on a question that many people had asked in the response when they registered for this event. And a lot of it came from students who are in this room right now, talking about a lot of the hopelessness that they face. And particularly as it relates to student activism, I was wondering if you could touch on some of your experiences during your time as a student and maybe offer some advice for students who do feel that hopelessness, given a lot of the issues that we face in our society with ecological catastrophe on the horizon that we're also facing right now, wealth inequality, the onset of fascism. So how would you advise students who want to get involved in making social justice changes and advancing those changes within their university and also in their greater community?
Well, general advice is very easy. The general advice is, you've already given it. Get engaged and involved. There are many opportunities. A lot of repression in the country, but it's still a very free country by comparative standards. And nobody's going to break, we're not going to have stormtroopers break into this meeting and haul you out and put you in concentration camps. It's not a small thing. That does happen in much of the world. Doesn't happen here. That means we're free to talk, to deliberate, to think, to grasp the opportunities that exist, carry them forward. Now, the second part of your question, what should people do right where you are? That's the kind of question that has to be answered by people right where you are, who know the circumstances, the conditions, the barriers, the audience you're trying to reach, find the best tactics to reach them and carry it forward. Can be done. Let's go back to the 60s as an example. Take my own university in the 60s, MIT, Science Engineering School, was a pretty conservative place in the 1960s. Not the faculty. The faculty was very active and organized, but the student body was quite doing their job. They didn't want to hear about anything. A small group of students, so small that I can list their names, formed a collective called the Rosa Luxemburg Collective. Many of those people are still very active today. I've done many things since. You probably know about them. Mike Albert, Steve Shalom, Pete Bomer, others got together, started talking among student groups, started small meetings with them, began small activities. Anyway, without going into the details, by 1968, the MIT was probably the most radical university in the country, if not in the world. Elected a student body, President Mike Albert, on a program so radical you can hardly believe it today. All of this changed through the dedicated activism of a small group of students. Well, that's what can be done. I can't tell you how to do it. You know better than I do the way to do it right where you are. I saw and was able to help someone It happened in my own university and other ones, but it's all possible. It's been done before under harsher conditions. And in fact, you mentioned the crisis that we're facing, two crises, the growing threat of nuclear war, which is very real, and the threat of environmental destruction, which is imminent. Human society has never faced questions like this. In all of human history, we have never been facing the prospect of destruction of organized human life on Earth. We now are. That's the burden that young people have to lift. And that's the challenge and the opportunity that we face. The most important generation in human history, which is going to make the most important decisions in human history. That's you, whether you like it or not. There's no way out. Your generation will decide whether organized human society, life in general, survives on Earth. Not much time, but still possibilities. It's a burden, challenge, responsibility, can energize and excite our activist dedication and commitments.
Thank you very much. One other question that I had was about the nature of the educational system. And you sort of touched on this with the onset of artificial intelligence in our society and how that relates to education. In particular, a lot of educators are seeing students using ChatGPT within their classrooms. I was wondering if you could touch on if there's a problem with our educational system that students are resorting to using artificial intelligence to turn in their assignments. Is there something that stifles creativity within the way that the system is structured to create these sort of outcomes that we're seeing?
Well, we should look and see what's happened to the educational system. I don't want to say that the 50s and the 60s were utopia, far from it, plenty wrong. But what's happened during the neoliberal years is very dramatic. The last 40 years, not just impressive class war, which has stolen $50 trillion from working class and the middle class and handed over to the top 1%. That's one part of it. Take a look at what's happened to the educational system. One part, strong, perfectly self-conscious public part of the neoliberal program has been to destroy public education. It's open, public, not hidden. State universities have been defunded. Schools have been defunded. There are all kinds of efforts to privatize and atomize education, each person on their own. Mass public education was one of the great contributions of the United States to modern democracy. Late 19th century, early 20th century, mass public education was a tremendous innovation. They didn't have it in Europe. It was innovated here, a major step towards democracy, raising all the way up to the universities, the land-grant universities, public universities, unknown in Europe, were a major step in educating, training, creating science, technology, educated population ready to participate in a democratic society. It had its downside, what you properly pointed to in your opening remarks. The land-grant universities were on territory that was stolen by brutal violence from the indigenous populations, virtually without exception. So I'm not saying it was some lovely heavenly enterprise, but with regard to American democracy was an enormous step forward. Neoliberal period wants to dismantle all of this, defund colleges and universities, defund schools, impose a business model on universities, top heavy with administrators, cut down on faculty independence, use the standard business model of trying to get the cheapest labor possible. So instead of tenured professors, let's hire adjuncts who are defenseless, graduate students who are defenseless, no salaries, we can throw them out if we don't want it. See exactly what's happening through the economy generally, creating what's called a precarious living week to week and so on. Let's do that in the universities. The schools, it's basically defunding, radical defunding. Well, that's part of the project of dismantling society in the interests of concentrated private power. So a lot has happened to the educational institutions. Fortunately, there's resistance at the university level. Graduate students, adjuncts are organizing to unionize, to demand basic rights. That's a good step forward. At the K-12 level, there are teacher strikes around the country. In the most right-wing states, West Virginia, Arizona, teachers are organizing, carrying out actions to try to pressure the right-wing legislatures to fund the schools so children have a chance for a decent education. They have a lot of public support. I happen to live in Tucson, Arizona, where the legislature is antediluvian. They want to kill the public education system. There's tremendous support for the teachers. You drive around town, every lawn has signs saying, it's called here, the slogan is "Red for Ed," support the teachers. Well, these are constant struggles that go on. Class struggle doesn't end. If one side gives up, the other side wins. We've been through a period when the masters have been winning, and it's been very harmful to society, but it's not the end. The struggle can go on, can recover, go forward, as has often happened in the past.
Thank you so much. Everyone, please give a round of applause. Professor Chomsky, that was a very large round of applause to a room of about 200 people right now at OSU. So now we're moving to the Q&A section, and we have Fatima and Dena in the back who will be passing around mics to folks who would like to ask questions. So please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and they will pass the mic to you.
Hi, I was just wondering, sorry, I'm bad at talking. Hey, I'm really shy. Okay, go to someone else.
I'm wondering about your use of the term neoliberal, because a lot of the policies you seem to attribute to neoliberalism sound like the kind of things conservatives would pursue. I'm just trying to understand what you mean by neoliberal.
Did you get that? Did you get that question, Professor Chomsky?
I'm afraid not. It doesn't get onto the captions. So could you repeat it?
No problem. The question was, what do you mean by neoliberalism? Because what you were discussing seems to be what conservatives are pushing the United States. But could you give a broader definition of what you mean by that?
Well, if you look up Wikipedia or the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll get a definition of neoliberalism. The definition is basically reliance on market forces, reducing the role of government so that individual free entrepreneurship can flourish and everybody will be happy. That's the official definition. Has absolutely nothing to do with reality. Nothing. Have 40 years to look at it. What we find is that in practice, Reagan, Thatcher in England, others around the world to a lesser extent, simply opened the floodgates for massive robbery of the population on the part of concentrated economic power and expanded the state to support them. Policy decisions were made right at every point of the line to lead to this result. And it led to it. I gave you some figures before. So is there reliance on the market? It's a joke. One of the first things that Reagan did was bail out Continental Illinois, the biggest bank bailout in American history. Is that reliance on the market? No, it's benefiting the financial institutions which were taking over the country as the country moved from industrialization to financial robbery. That was one of the main goals of the neoliberal system. By now, financial institutions, which are mostly predatory, have about half the profit, if not more, in the country, not manufacturing institutions. Corporate power makes more money by exploiting cheap labor elsewhere by design. It's the economy has become what honest economists call a bailout economy. Open the doors to free robbery, risky investments. When it breaks down, as it always does, and crashes, the public comes in and bails you out. Step by step, Reagan started it right away. The Reagan administration ended with a savings and loan crisis, a bigger one. Again, the public stepped in and bailed out the perpetrators. Then comes Clinton's high-tech crisis in the late 90s. Later, the 2008 huge crisis where the public came in to bail out the perpetrators and not the victims. Same happened during the COVID crisis. Number of billionaires has shot up enormously during the COVID crisis as the Treasury Department moved in to make sure that the rich and powerful are properly taken care of. The rest can hang on the vine. That's the bailout economy that we live in. What about free? We're told that there are free trade agreements. Clinton, this is mainly. Take a look at the free trade agreements. They're the most protectionist agreements in human history. They have very high protection, unprecedented protection for what are called intellectual property rights, means patent rights of a kind that never existed in the past. That's why you pay twice as much for pharmaceuticals as other countries. That's why a COVID vaccine is going to cost maybe over $100 when it costs $1 to produce. This is massive robbery of the population. You want to get some actual details, I suggest you look at a book by a very good economist, Dean Baker, a book called Rigged. It's free. You can pick it up free on the internet. Goes into the details of the massive robbery of the population imposed by the highly protectionist measures of the investor rights agreements that parade as free trade. We can go on, but the point is there's two definitions of neoliberalism. There's the one that you can read in the dictionary, and there's the one that corresponds to actual practice. And the right definition for that is just savage class war. And you can see it in the outcomes.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. we have some more questions.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I happen to be part of the movement in the 60s, and later I had a career, 30-year career with unions. I now find myself working for healthcare for all. I have seen the healthcare turn into an industry. It's actually a business model in which now investors from afar are investing in clinics. I'm seeing doctors turn into employees. I'm seeing pharmaceuticals and insurance companies lobby more than any other companies in the world in our Congress. Could you please give us some advice of how to turn this around? Because our mortality rate has fallen since 79 to now 77 in the last few years. Thank you.
Well, the healthcare system is a pretty good illustration of neoliberalism in practice. You go back to the 1970s, the US healthcare system was far from wonderful, but it was pretty much within the spectrum of healthcare systems in advanced industrial countries. On the regressive end, but not way off the spectrum. Now it is totally off the spectrum. I don't have to give you the figures, you know them better than I do, I'm sure. Healthcare costs in the United States are almost twice as high as in comparable countries, and the outcomes are among the worst anywhere. We actually have the population has been strongly in favor of universal health care. Can't get it through. Concentrated private power has managed to knock it down time after time. The result is plenty of profit for insurance companies, plenty of profit for hospitals, rotten health care. We have some of the worst outcomes in the industrial world. Infant mortality, others. And it shows up, I mean, some of it is just shocking. Take something as simple as maternal care, care for women after childbirth. Every country, rich and poor, has guaranteed maternal care for months after birth. Often paternal aid too. The United States is alone, along with a couple of Pacific islands, in not offering guaranteed health care for women. That's incidentally a central part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's highlighted in the Universal Declaration in 1948, special care for mothers. United States, off the spectrum. My wife happens to be Brazilian, so we spend time in Brazil. Brazil's not a rich country. It's not like the United States. 2 months guaranteed maternal care, 4 months if the family requests it. There was the London Financial Times, the world's major business journal, not exactly a radical rag, had an article a couple months ago by one of their editors about Bernie Sanders. It said, if Bernie Sanders was running for office in Germany, he could be running on the conservative Christian Democrat program. That's actually true. Take a look at his main demands: universal health care, free higher education. It's everywhere. Everybody has universal health care. Poor countries, rich countries, Mexico, Brazil, Germany, Finland, free higher education, almost everywhere. In fact, if you look at the United States, We even had free higher education not that long ago. It was called the GI Bill. 1950s, the GI Bill gave free higher education subsidized for veterans. That tremendously benefited the society. Huge, and the people themselves. A huge number of people who never would have gone to college made it through college, entered the society as productive individuals who could go on to create their own lives. Well, there was a flaw in that one too. It was racist and sexist. No women, no blacks. Okay. Nothing is perfect, but it was free higher education for white males. Well, that's that, and when the United States was a much poorer country then than it is now, it would be nothing to have free higher education and free universal health care. Actually, the United States has universal health care. It's called emergency rooms. If you can drag yourself to an emergency room somehow, they'll take good care of you, maybe very good care. Maybe you'll have to wait a couple of days for somebody to see you, but if they do, you'll get good care. It's the cruelest, most expensive form of universal health care you can imagine. That's our system. I should say, we can go on with that. That's what happens when you privatize, when you follow the rules of neoliberalism, not the actual practice, but the doctrines, which are not for the rich. The rich are free from them, but for the poor, for the middle classes, for the ordinary citizens. You go to a hospital, ER room with something, first thing you have to do is fill out a pile of forms, and then to see how much you're going to have to pay. And then it turns out there's something on the insurance policy in small print that you didn't read, so you have to pay even more than you thought. Well, there's more. Just as in the colleges, the neoliberal years have imposed a business model on the hospitals. You have what's called just-in-time delivery. That's what you do in an auto factory. You don't want the assembly line to stop. So you have everything set up carefully. So if something goes wrong, you immediately fix it, but you don't have any spare capacity because that's a waste. Well, what does that mean when something happens, like the COVID pandemic? There's no spare capacity. So the hospitals are immediately overflowing. People dying in corridors because there's no room to put them in. Take some European country like Germany, they could deal with it. They weren't following the business model. They had spare capacity for care, for diagnosis, and so on. You know, it's one reason why the United States record is one of the worst in the world. Privatized business models. It works for the rich, doesn't work for anyone else. We see it right in front of us. I should say this harms the whole society. There's a huge pile of books here you can see maybe. That's the urgent reading. And right on top of it happens to be a book called, an interesting book you might want to look at, called Inequality Kills Us All. It's about the health system by Stephen Bezruchka, who's a medical practitioner. And what he does is discuss how the radical inequality in the United States is harming everybody, including the rich, because one of the effects of inequality is to break down the social order. There are studies, goes back to work by forgot the names, Wilkinson and Pettit, I think, spirit level, who showed that if you track inequality and social disorder like crime, severe poverty, malnutrition, and so on, social diseases of all kinds, tracks inequality very closely. And if you look at the charts, the United States is off the chart. Other countries are more or less on the line, more inequality, more social disorder. The United States is off by itself. That's because it's followed the dual principles of neoliberalism. Neoliberal principles for the general population, but strong government, radical interference in markets for the benefit of the rich and powerful. That's where that $50 trillion comes from and much else, including the breakdown of the health system, which is a major scandal. Many other signs of this. Take, say, incarceration, another social pathology. You go back to the 1970s, incarceration rates in the United States were within the range of other comparable societies. Again, a little at the high end, but not by much. By now, it's 5 to 10 times as high. Is it because crime has increased? No. It's because society has been torn to shreds by policies designed for that purpose. In fact, we can go back to Margaret Thatcher's famous statement, there is no society. A homeless person on the street, that's her example, has no right to expect anything from society. Yes, it's his fault. Go out on your own. Well, there's a little footnote to that. As Margaret Thatcher knew very well, she was not an idiot. There's a very rich and complex society for wealth and power. Chambers of commerce, business associations, trade associations, rich network of organizational structure to protect and defend them. And then there's the powerful state, which they dominate and works in their interests. So plenty of society for the rich and powerful, but none for the homeless guy in the street or the mother who just had a baby. Society, not for them. They have to take care of themselves. That's neoliberalism in practice, not the dictionary definition.
Thank you so much. We have time for maybe one more question.
Hello, Professor Chomsky. My question is about information overload. With the explosion of the internet and more recently social media, there seems to be more information than any individual person can take in, and attempting to do that will expose you to a bunch of misinformation, and generally just it becomes very difficult to decide what to believe, what is right. But on the other hand, if you draw back and just look into that at all, you're kind of dooming society to allowing the rich and powerful to take over because of an undereducated middle and lower class. So I guess my question is, how do you find a balance between those two extremes?
Well, first of all, let's look at information overload. That's existed as long as the printing press has been around. Go to the OSU library. There's so much information there. In a million lifetimes, you could never begin to absorb it. You want to understand biology? Go to the biology lab, go biology section of the university library. You couldn't possibly go through it. The internet speeded it up. So now, instead of having to cross the street to the library, you can push a key and, if you're lucky, maybe get some of the articles. But that's basically a small change. The major change, huge change, came with the development of public libraries and the printing press. That was an enormous change, gave tremendous overload. Do people use them? Well, I'm afraid not. Just, you can tell me from your experience. I happen to live in a suburb. I don't anymore, but most of my life I lived in Boston, in a suburb which had a very good library. I used it all the time. I'd sometimes take my grandchildren there on weekends had a very good children's library. Practically no young people there. About the only young people you saw were from the small Korean minority in the town. The kids from the affluent suburbs were looking at video games or something like that. They weren't in the library. You know your own experiences. So yes, plenty of information is there. Are you using it? Well, you can answer for yourselves. Now, there are studies which show that it's not being used, that the internet, unfortunately, for some people, it does enhance the information available to them. The overload, incidentally, is overcome by discerning what's important and what's not important. That's critical intelligence. That's the way to deal with the overload. It always has been. But what the internet seems to have done is to drive people into small bubbles of self-reinforcing opinion and ideas. Well, that's not going to lead to a democratic society. Actually, there was just a study that came out of Generation Z. That's you, I think. Investigated what are the sources of news for Generation Z. Turned out that about 4% read newspapers, about 4% look at television news. Facebook is becoming too old-fashioned, so you don't want to use that too much. The large majority, I forget the numbers, but a large majority are getting their picture of the world from TikTok and Instagram. Well, you can see whether that accords with your experience. That's what the study claims overall. What kind of educational experience is this? So yes, the internet has plenty of information, plenty of disinformation, but it's going to take a discerning, critical intelligence to handle it properly. And to do it alone is very hard. That's why all progress throughout the world has been with organized groups, labor unions, political organizations, activist groups. You worked the feminist movement, for example, began with consciousness-raising groups, not just individuals thinking about it. That's how change takes place. Alone, you're a victim. Together with other people, you can work things out. That's, I think, what history tells us and what just thinking for a moment tells us. Well, as I say, you can judge from your own experiences much better than I can.
I had one final personal question that I wanted to ask you, Professor Chomsky, and that was, how do you keep up the energy? So you've written 4 or 5 books in the past couple of years. You give countless talks and interviews, daily meetings. You're still teaching classes at the University of Arizona. And you have more energy than me, and I'm 24. So how do you keep that up right now?
I look at the world around me, see the massive problems that have to be dealt with, see people like you in the audience who have to take up the challenge and the burden of a kind that has never existed in human history. There's just no choice. You have to keep struggling as long as you can, as hard as you can. We don't have any alternatives.
very much hope you are able to hear the great level of positive from the outreach. I also want to express my sincere appreciation of your generosity, of your time and effort. And hope you can continue to keep up your health and energy, and hope in the near future we may have another opportunity to listen to your wise words. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone so much. There are free books in the back, so please grab one on your way out. There's about 60 of them, so it'll be first come, first served. So if you're a student, go grab one, please.
Also, because we changed to a bigger room from the earlier plan to accommodate more people, so we went up the budget. So today's drink was totally provided by Mohammed. All the drinks are from Mohammed.
Okay,
Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
I had to be
Keep
with
in
you.
touch. We really appreciate it.
Okay, have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Professor Chomsky.